Scott Hanson, who's going to be delivering our keynote speaker. He is our keynote speaker. I've known Scott for many, many years, and one of the first, got to know Scott socially, and he invited us, my wife and I, Ann, to his Christmas party. And Ann and I went to his first Christmas party. And I don't know if it was the first one. He has a wonderful antique historic home. He invited us over to his party at Christmas, and so Ann and I were having a great time at his party, except we were at a neighbor's house. I kept wondering, where's Scott? Where's Andrew? And somehow we figured that out. And he also has, great friends and great neighbors, so it was really you want to go to Scott's parties, and his neighbors will entertain you too. It's cool. So anyway, Scott's got a lot to tell you today as well, and I'm going to, without further ado, I get to say that, Scott Hanson, please join us up here.
Thank you, Mark, and good morning, everyone. I'm going to take a sip of water before I start. So just a little bit about me and why I'm standing here. I think many of you may know that I'm the author of a little 700-page book called Restoring Your Historic House, the Comprehensive Guide for Homeowners. I'm also a historic preservation consultant. I've worked on more than 100 historic tax credit projects. I've written more than 30 National Register nominations. I've worked for the City of Portland Planning Department in historic preservation. I've been a carpenter, a painter, a paper hanger, a designer, a historic home owner, a historic district commissioner. I've come at this subject from a whole lot of angles, and that is really why I wrote the book, was after waiting 30 years for someone to write this book, I determined I was qualified, and my publisher really wanted me to do it. So enough about that. Welcome to Maine. I don't know how many of you have been to Maine before or have wanted to come to Maine. We've been known as vacation land for more than a century. But Maine is more than vacation land. And we're going to talk a little bit about what Maine has been historically and where you are. And then we're going to tie it into what you do. So to get started, we have this quote. Does anyone recognize who the quote is from? It's Henry David Thoreau, and of course it was written in 1854, and it's a touch dated, so I've updated it to the unquestionable ability of humans to elevate their lives by conscious endeavor. And what the hell does that have to do with window preservation? Well, we'll get there. This is New England, 1676. A rather highly inaccurate map once you get away from the coast. That's Lake Champlain they have in Massachusetts. They have the coast pretty close. And of course, the coast of Massachusetts is where European settlement starts in New England, permanent settlement in 1620 with the arrival of the Pilgrims at Plymouth at the base of Cape Cod. And that's the red star on the map there. Within 55, 60 years, by the time this map was made, the English had filled eastern Massachusetts, and they had cut it bare. Trees gone. Between heat, cooking, and construction, they just wiped it right out. And that created a problem because they had a big town, eventually a city developing at Boston, which had a great demand for building materials and heating lump wood and cooking wood. And transportation was limited to water, really. We had no railroads, not even canals, so just natural water courses. And the problem for Massachusetts, which had lots of wood in the west, was they had no rivers that came to Boston. The rivers came down through other colonies, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and then you'd have to go all the way around Cape Cod to get back to Boston. So Massachusetts had a wood problem. And the solution was that they also had a province called Maine to the east, which was wooded and had great rivers that all flowed directly to the sea within an easy sail of Boston. So the attraction of Maine for the people of Massachusetts was primarily for its wood. It also served as a nice buffer to the French and their Native American allies further to the east and north, kind of keeping them out of Massachusetts. So, pine trees. It is the central symbol on our state seal, the white pine. It was the reason Maine was a desirable place to the Europeans who were settling in Massachusetts. Enormous white pines, so important that the king had a royal mast agent here in Westbrook at the Tate House Museum, now in Portland at Stroudwater. It's open to the public, well worth a visit, built in 1755. The king actually laid claim to all pines of a certain size for masts for the Royal Navy, the world's greatest navy at the time. They had no suitable mast trees in Europe. They had to piece them together from multiple lengths of trees. And the great white pines of Maine could serve as a mast. And so this natural resource in Maine was hugely valuable to the people of Massachusetts and in Europe and England. So large lots of Maine, thousands and thousands of acres, were purchased by groups of wealthy individuals in Britain and Boston called proprietors. They really were an early form of a corporation before such things existed. And they subdivided these vast tracts of land into these long, skinny lots that all fronted onto a river. They were 100, 200, 300 acre lots. And they all had access to the river so they could get the wood out. And water-powered sawmills were established quite early. Here in Westbrook, there were sawmills in the 17th century. By 1716, 30 miles up the coast at Brunswick-Topsham, the Projectscott proprietors established the first sawmills. And this movement up into Maine progressed over a century or more. Going as far as tidewater, as far as you could sail a ship, and then they would build the mills, and then they would use the water of the rivers to bring the wood down to the mills. So we're going to take a tour up into the woods of Maine with Henry David Thoreau, famous essayist, philosopher, and poet. He is the author of the quote at the beginning. He made a trip to Bangor and then up into the woods to Mount Katahdin in 1846. At that point, more than 2 centuries after the Pilgrims arrived in Massachusetts, there had only been about a dozen Europeans who had ever been to Mount Katahdin. As he describes it, he goes 100 miles above Bangor by river, first by bateau, which is a flat-bottomed boat, and then by canoe, and then hikes another 30 miles beyond that to get to Katahdin. Along the way, he talks about the logging industry and the lumber industry, and he notes that at Old Town, which is what is shown here, there were, in 1837, as I read, 250 sawmills on the Penobscot and its tributaries above Bangor, the greater part of them in the immediate neighborhood. And they saw 200 millions of board feet annually. To this is to be added the lumber of the Kennebec, Androscoggin, Saco, Passamaquoddy, and other streams, which really gives a sense of what was going on in the woods of Maine. And then he talks about the process of getting the wood to the mills and how these camps are established on lots in the woods in the summer and fall to be used in the winter while they cut the lumber. They move it by oxen or horse on the snow to the riverbanks where they stack it as high as it'll go, waiting for the high water in spring, during which they'll bring it down to the mills. And if you look closely in this image, you see little tiny figures with pikes on the rocks trying to move the logs through the rocks at the base of the falls. And then into these massive log drives, bringing millions and millions of board feet down the rivers to the mills. Here we see the bridge between Brunswick and Topsom around 1830. And if you look closely behind the bridge, there's a sawmill on the island and being powered by the river. In the foreground, there's a bateau with some sawn lumber and some bundles of shingles. Just up the hill from here, about the same time, the Whitten House was built. In 1827, started as a cape. About 20 years later, it had a full second story and finished attic added to it. And it is still there. It is the house Marc was referring to, where we have our party. And I'm using it as an example here of how local construction was in the early 19th century. Within a half a mile of the house, we have the granite quarry where the foundation stone came from, the brickyard where the chimneys came from. All of the lumber was cut upstream and came down to the mill you just saw by the bridge. There was a blacksmith shop on the river. There were shingle mills. There was a sash and door mill. And nearly all of the materials for the house were local. And the small amount of milling that occurred prior to them getting to the building site happened right there, with water power. The lime for the plaster and mortar came from Rockport by sailing ship about 50 miles away. Glass was manufactured in Portland, 25 miles away. And iron was probably the only thing imported either from the UK or the Mid-Atlantic area. So the construction of a house at that point here in Maine was very sustainable. Everything was local. And there were, other than the blacksmith burning charcoal, there was nothing putting pollutants in the air. Very, very contained. And here we can actually see the quarry on Barron's Hill on the upper right behind the houses on Summer Street, the sawmill on the lower left, the brickyard on the lower right, all within sight of the house. And this is a wonderful photo I found in the town history collection of a man working in a sash mill in Topsom in the 19th century. And this is where this starts to really connect with what you guys do, obviously. Window sashes and doors were the first pre-assembled building parts that were commonly used in construction in America. Everything else came as rough lumber and was milled on site with molding planes and chisels and drills and, just clapboards and shingles were also made in a mill, but they were not pre-assembled. So your window sash is really the item that comes already to install. So now we're going to jump back to that cheerful individual, Henry David Thoreau, who noted that the mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation. I imagine the women don't want me to update that quote. His most famous work is a book called Walden, or Life in the Woods, and it recounts his 2 years and some months living in a little cabin on Walden Pond out in Concord, Massachusetts. One of the interesting things about the book is he goes into great detail describing the construction of his house, his little cabin. And this is a reconstruction of it. And he cuts the trees on site to form the frame. He buys some lumber used from another building. He buys refuse or secondhand shingles to shingle it with. And he goes into a lot of detail and, and is describing this very hands-on form of construction, which was about to disappear in the 1840s with the age of industrialization. So, up to this point, as I've said, everything happened on site with, your shingles and your clapboards milled elsewhere and your windows and doors milled elsewhere. But it was pretty much, done by hand on site. And one of the things that stood out to me in looking at Thoreau's description of his project was that he paid $2.43 for 2 second-hand windows with glass in a cabin that cost $28 and some cents in total. Windows were expensive, even then. Used windows were expensive, even then. And I think this is, of course, about the fact that they're very complex to build. There's a lot of work in creating the 12 pieces of wood that make a 6-light sash. And he had 12 light sashes. And you all understand this probably better than anyone else in the world today. But I think it's important to note that windows have always been expensive. Glass was expensive, and the amount of labor that went into creating a window caused them to be valuable. And it's a fact that I think people should be reminded of today. And of course, they were the beginning of a long process by which building houses, constructing a house on a site from raw materials, evolved from a process of making to a process of installing. And today, we're in a very different place. And it starts with these water-powered mills that were making doors and window sashes, combined with new modes of transportation based on steam, the great power of the 19th century. This is a steam locomotive made here in Portland at the Portland Company. Steam ships and the two coming together at ports where you could build something anywhere and take it anywhere else. And that was a dramatic change in how our society works. Not only could people move, materials could move. Coal could be carried anywhere, and was. And so this dramatic change in how our society was structured and functioned occurred in the building industry and in everything else. But we're going to stay focused on the building industry. So you start seeing bigger planing mills doing all kinds of mill work, and they didn't have to be located on a river for water power. They could go anywhere there was a railroad or a steamship could bring coal. And they got bigger. This is the Great Southern Lumber Company sawmill in Louisiana, which at one point was the largest in the world. And the millwork companies got bigger and bigger. This is the E.L. Roberts Company in Chicago, whose catalog in the year 1900 was 348 pages. These are 2 of the 32 pages of windows they offered. They had 6 pages of corner blocks, 16 pages of stair parts, and on and on, 348 pages that you could get anywhere. You went to the catalog, you ordered it. The railroads and the steamships brought it to you. It was very different from how Whitten House was built in 1827, where you can see the ripples of a hand plane in the floorboards. So let's jump back to Topsom Village and Whitten House in the year 2022, where for the first time in about a century, a new house has been built. Over the past several years, still not finished because you may have heard there are supply chain issues. This is it. I won't comment on the design. I will remind you of where the materials for Whitten House came from. And then we'll talk about where the materials for this house came from. And the answer is all over the world. Up to 40% of a typical American home is made of imported materials, including insulation, lumber, cement, steel, and electrical equipment. Even in Maine, our lumber is often coming from China. Sometimes it is manufactured lumber products like plywood that are manufactured in China from trees cut in the United States. This isn't necessarily efficient, but it is the world we have gotten to, where a window manufacturing plant in China looks like this and produces unrepairable crap that will have to be replaced in 25 years. It can't be repaired, it can't be recycled, it can just go in a landfill. And then you have to replace it over and over and over again. This is a problem. Compared to our sash maker in Topsom in the 19th century, who produced windows that are still in use and that can be repaired to continue in use for 2 more centuries. And the price of all of this is that we have gone from coal and oil to a climate crisis created by this change in how we do things. We have polluted skies, We've polluted the waters. We've done some good work on cleaning up that side of it, as our dirty manufacturing has gotten shipped to Asia, where they're now dealing with the polluted water, but we're still dealing with the climate change issues from the air. And the unintended consequences of this industrialization has been this, and this, and this. So how does that relate to historic preservation? The preservation movement in America was founded on saving landmark buildings. Here we have the great architect Philip Johnson, who was a dreadful human being, and other prominent New Yorkers protesting to save Penn Station. Ultimately, they failed. Penn Station was lost. But the effort to save Grand Central Station in New York created the legal precedents for communities protecting their historic resources. And so these New Yorkers ultimately laid the foundation for the modern preservation movement with many others. But in the 60 years since, we've come to realize that preservation can be about more than saving landmark buildings. It can be about saving whole communities. And that the history of people who did not live in great mansions or achieve great noteworthy events are also worthy of preservation. So we're preserving neighborhoods, we're preserving affordable housing. Almost half of my historic tax credit projects are creating affordable housing. They're combining historic tax credits and low-income housing tax credits and turning schools into senior housing within communities. And so preservation has expanded from that idea that we just have to save the great monuments of architecture and the houses related to the most noteworthy people of the past. And now, I think finally in the 21st century, we're really coming to realize that historic preservation is part of something much bigger, which is saving the planet. To stop the focus on throwing away and refocus on repairing what we've got. As Richard Moe of the National Trust, now retired, has said, the greenest building is the one that already exists. The Whitten House was home to the Whitten family for 2 generations. It then served as the Topsom Public Library for 60 years. And then I bought it and I'm slowly turning it back into a home. That labor done by individuals on the ground in 1827 and then the expansion 25 years later has not been wasted. It has continued to provide home, a public institution. It has become part of the character of the place and can continue to indefinitely if it's repaired and cared for, because it is built of repairable materials. These windows on the second floor are from the 1850s expansion. When I bought the house, they had had 0 attention since 1850. And this photo was taken on a cool fall morning when I had tightened up the window on the right, but hadn't done the window on the left yet. And you see the condensation on the storm window on the left, and none on the right. That took me 30 minutes with $3 of basic materials from Home Depot, just to tighten it up, until I can afford to get it restored. And have Marc's amazing new weather stripping put in. And you need to deal with the environmental issues related to lead, now that we recognize that that's a problem. So, you know, what you do isn't inexpensive, but what it does is it creates something. It doesn't create anything, sorry. It allows something to continue serving a function that it has already served for a century or more. And I hope that in addressing the issues of a changing climate, we will eventually see a movement toward repairability in new products. And I think you guys are the example of what we need to do as a culture, is to re-engage with building things to last, to be repairable, to serve for multiple generations, and to stop making such a mess of the world we live in. So window preservation is part of the solution to climate change. Historic preservation generally is, but specifically what you do is part of the solution to the challenges we're facing as a world. It's not about our community specifically, it's not about the United States, it's not about North America, it's about the globe. We're all being affected. So we have a global crisis built on the consumption of junk and have forgotten how to build and consume sustainably. The work you do is saving windows and helping to preserve a livable world. And that applause is for yourselves. So, back to Thoreau. I know of no more encouraging fact than the unquestionable ability of man to elevate his life by conscious endeavor. The hell does that mean? As I read it, it means that the way to have a better life is to do something that matters. And that's what you guys do. So keep at it, have a great conference, and thank you.
Thank you.